Good morning. I'm Nikki Rinderer, and I am privileged and pleased to serve as your worship associate today. We welcome all of you to our service, especially those of you who are searching for a spiritual home. Many of us were once too seeking for something larger than ourselves to which we could belong, a sense of rootedness to hold us together, a sense of rootedness to hold us as we create meaning together. We do that well here, though not perfectly. In this congregation, we strive not for perfection, but for authenticity and connection. Whether it's your first time in worship with us or your 100th time, we hope that you'll find here questions that stretch you, people to befriend you, and liberal religious values that challenge you to join us in loving boldly, living justly, and welcoming radically. Our theme for the month of July is liberation, and our theme for today in particular is interdependence. So, touching on independence, dependence, interdependence, I now have a little less than 2 minutes to talk about something I've been mulling over all my life. Back in the 70s, it was pretty popular among us hippies to talk about moving beyond dependence or independence to interdependence. But it seems to me now that that was much too simplistic of a view. I've come to realize that in our lives there is a time and place where any of these things can be good or bad. For instance, we often hear the word dependence, sometimes combined with codependence, as a bad thing, and independence as being valued. 38 years ago, before Barb and I were a couple, I was released from a hospital stay with no job and no place to live. Now, Barb was willing to help me out, but she has her limits. She was so concerned that I would be too dependent on her that she told me I could stay with her, but needed to have a job and a place to live within 1 week. You can see how that worked out. But there is a place for dependence. It doesn't make sense for someone who needs help due to illness or disability to not accept help in the name of independence. And on the other hand, it is also not good to be needy and helpless when you're perfectly capable of taking care of yourself. In actuality, when Barb imposed her tough love restriction on me, I did in fact get a job and an apartment within a week, and am now a better and more independent person for it. So then we come to interdependence. Highly valued, but in many ways something that just is. No matter how independent or dependent we think we are all irrevocably intertwined and interdependent. The consequences of that are sometimes bad, sometimes good, and sometimes in between. But the actuality of our interdependence is inescapable. It is up to us to choose when we should act independently, when a little dependence is in order, and when and how to function effectively and ethically in our interdependent state. Welcome to Tapestry, an interdependent Unitarian Universalist home for spiritual and personal connection.
I said this earlier, but it's good to be back with you. I spent the 4th of July weekend in Oklahoma visiting family. It's a very patriotic place. I don't think I've ever seen so many American flags in my life. As the 4th of July comes around every year, I have a little bit of internal struggle. Part of me resents what the American flag means for a lot of people. And another part of me is grateful to live in a pretty amazing country. In the midst of fireworks and patriotic music and the smell of cookouts, I often feel like we have two very different understandings about what's great about this country. One source of that difference of opinion has to do with a basic difference between conservative or progressive points of view. For some, what makes America great is a sense of tradition and a static identity of who we are and who we are. It's a nationalism rooted in a particular understanding of our history. For most of us, I think, the thing that makes America great is a deep history of resistance and liberation. It's the breaking of tradition that makes us great. It's our insistence on adapting our worldview to new information. America isn't great because of what it was, but because of what it's willing to grow into being, generation after generation. Now, I've written and delivered that sermon several times, the What Makes America Great sermon. I think most of us agree it's our innovation, adaptation, and liberation. So this year, I'm thinking more about how that history unfolded in the first place. As we celebrate the good and reflect on the not-so-good pieces of our history, what really caused it all to happen? How can we keep that spirit of innovation and liberation? And how can we best confront the fearful tendencies that limit our possibilities? How can we understand our own history? Well, any story depends on characters who move the plot forward, whether that's the Three Little Pigs or Jesus or Abraham Lincoln. When we hear a story, we tend to think of the actions of the main characters. And for a very long time, this was the way we understood history to unfold. One grand story propelled forward by the actions of the major characters involved. In academic terms, it was called the great man theory. In the 19th century, this idea emerged that it was really influential individuals and the series of actions that they made that composed history. It came through their personal charisma and their intelligence and their strength. The theory says that the personal actions defined history. About 20 years later, in 1860, a competing theory emerged. Herbert Spencer pointed out that those so-called great men were products of their society. Their actions would have been impossible without the right circumstances, allowing them to happen. Since the late 1800s, serious students of history have largely replaced the great man theory with social history. Most of us, however, are not serious students of history. We're curious people who enjoy a good story. And when we look to understand history, especially American history, we look to the stories of influential people who made it all happen. It's a very easy to get swept up into this great man view of history. The shortcomings are pretty obvious, though. I mean, the name itself is ridiculous. If history is shaped by great individuals, don't you think at least a few of them would be women? Slowly but surely, we're coming to realize that there are still other great figures who don't fit neatly into the category of man or woman. Transgender and gender non-binary and gender non-conforming people have also played pivotal roles in history in many civilizations. We had a short but really powerful conversation about that at our General Assembly in June. And our list of sources of our Unitarian Universalist tradition, one of the sources refers to the words and deeds of prophetic women and men. But this year, the Assembly together voted to recommend shifting that language to simply acknowledge that the words and deeds of prophetic people inform who we are and who we aspire to be. In the 21st century, the great man theory seems almost absurd in its sexist language. But that's just the beginning of the problems. For the most part, history books are written by the winners. I got a lesson in this from an early age. I don't know why this stuck with me, but near my home, where I grew up, there is a small but respectable art museum. Because it was so close, we visited regularly and became familiar with the collection. It's grown over the years. Still, the most prominent pieces in the main wing are paintings from late medieval and early Renaissance art. And in those days, art was incredibly expensive. It was mostly commissioned by the church and sometimes by wealthy individuals. But even then, it was very religious in nature. So looking at these paintings, we sort of played a game of religious symbolism. You can always tell who someone is in a painting by the symbol that is associated with them. And we got pretty good at it. Most of them were recognizable. Sometimes, though, an unidentifiable character shows up in a painting. Even at the birth of Jesus, you get an occasional extra person. Those extra people couldn't be identified by religious symbols because they're the people that commissioned the painting. They had themselves painted into scenes of the Holy Family. It was a medieval version of Photoshop. And that stuck with me as a kid. That people would have the ego to inject themselves like that. It taught me how much power money has in the world of the arts and recording our history. Whether it's in paintings or in books, wealthy people, the ruling class, decide what gets portrayed. And from their perspective, history was a story of great men who had, by their own actions, shaped the course of the world, because that was their story. The great men version of history is so wrapped up in its own self-obsession that it's blind to a much more complicated and more impactful movement of entire communities and entire cultures. It excludes anyone who's not part of the powerful elite, and it offers a deeply distorted picture of the way history actually unfolds. Understanding history through a lens of human relationship isn't always easy, though. It can be a little bit discouraging on an individual level. Feels like we have less control. Maybe you came to realize the fact that you got up this morning and came here to Tapestry, to this amazing community, is not completely a choice. There are circumstances of your life that propel you to this moment and to this decision. Sure, you could have decided to do something different, but coming here this morning is what made sense to you. You could see that as disempowering. You could also appreciate the fact that your decisions now rest in an intricate historical network of previous decisions and cultures. I think about this every time someone asks me about my calling into ministry. When I meet new people and explain to them that I'm a minister, almost immediately they want to know how I came into this profession. I feel like they expect a dramatic story of revelation or journeying in the wilderness. My story is not very exciting, though. After being involved in church for a very long time as a young person, ministry was a very clear and logical next step. There was no conversion experience or sudden realization. It was just the next step down a road that now seems to have been laid out in front of me. That used to feel really inadequate, like I hadn't chosen it or earned it on my own. Now, though, I'm learning to be grateful for a stream of history that I'm a part of. I didn't land here in this life on my own. I'm grateful for a history shared with me by my parents and by my community. It's a history that embraces scientific learning and compassion for the marginalized. It's a history of liberal religious thought that strives to choose hope and find wonder in life. Being a part of this movement is not entirely my choice, but it's a gift. I'm spending a lot of time this morning talking about the great man theory of history and moving away from it because it's so pernicious. It's not just the perspective of the ruling class or a conservative view of the world. We too have mistakenly understood history as a story enacted by a few leading powerful figures. And it's hard not to this week. With the G20 meeting in Germany, with a simmering conflict with North Korea and a very clearly singular powerful person there, with an American president who seems bigger than life and operating by his own rule book, it can feel very much like the world we live in is defined by the actions of a few powerful people. They're the main characters and we're just extras. But we need to pause and remember that Donald Trump didn't magically arise from nowhere, as if ordained by God. He was elected by a lot of American people, a whole bunch of them. His personality and his message may not have garnered a lot of support in a different decade, but in 2016, he emerged as a leader under the right circumstances. Yes, there was strategy and money involved, but he also spoke a message that people agreed with. We might see him as a symptom rather than a cause. He's a symptom of a culture obsessed with wealth, all the while denying that poverty nips at the heels of vast communities in our country. He's a symptom of a marriage between fundamentalist Christianity's obsession with sexual control and a marriage with the Republican Party. None of these phenomena are new. They're the circumstances that give rise to a particular man. The circumstances, the intricate network of everyday human beings has made the current situation possible. I also believe, and what I want us to remember most today is that the same intricate network of everyday human beings can also change history. Too often, we've understood liberation as an individual act of courage, too. We turn to heroes, to Dr. King and Rosa Parks, Gandhi, Susan B. Anthony, Harvey Milk, Frederick Douglass, Cesar Chavez, and we lift them up on a pedestal and give them great praise, and we forget that they too emerged as products of their circumstances. They emerged from communities of brave people who chose to hope and struggle for a better world. They just gave voice to what was already stirring. Before I went to visit family for the 4th of July, I was in New Orleans for General Assembly with several of our members. A handful of you have been to General Assembly. It's a gathering of around 4,000 Unitarians. It's a typical conference with a convention hall that is chock full of things to buy. So on the last day there, weary from hours of workshops and lectures, I roamed through the convention hall. I didn't intend to buy anything, but amid the hundreds of bumper stickers, t-shirts, pins, and coffee mugs, a poster caught my eye. I will eventually put it in my office, but I have an image to share with you today. The poster contains the mugshots of 328 freedom riders who were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. There are no mugshots of the first freedom riders because they never made it to Jackson. So in 1961, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this story, over 400 young African American and white people played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement. These freedom riders used nonviolent methods to desegregate bus depots and train stations and airports across the South. In many ways, their bravery makes them heroes. They confronted brutal beatings, arrests, as you can see, and imprisonment at Mississippi's Infinite State Penitentiary. U.S. Congressman John Lewis is on this poster. I think he's up in the upper right-hand area. The remaining 327 names are completely unfamiliar to me. And that's why I absolutely love this image. It's a reminder that thousands and thousands of people were on the front lines of the civil rights movement. And each of those freedom riders had their own network of family, friends, and faith communities that encouraged their bravery and help mend their wounds. It's the anonymity of their faces that's most hopeful in this picture to me, because it reminds me that the power to change the world is with us and our network of loving relationships. What we read about in the newspaper makes for a good story, but so does the Three Little Pigs. A movement is really a group of people changing the world, not an ideology espoused by a leader. And yes, leaders emerge here and there when the conditions are right, but leaders are not the ones who make history happen. The Underground Railroad was more than Harriet Tubman or the solitary brave choice of someone to escape. Stonewall wasn't a single brave gay person who stood up to police. It was a riot. A community that knew and loved each other through years of mutual support and secret protecting. They fought back together. Liberation grows out of our cooperation, not out of individualism. And we're best able to carve out a loving place in the world through working hand in hand with other people, whether it's political liberation or spiritual liberation. They're not exactly the same, but they are definitely intertwined. That's why we're here, after all, in a sanctuary, gathered together in worship. We're here to be in a community of people choosing hope together. We Unitarian Universalists worship together to inspire and to be inspired by one another. We seek liberation together. Now, one of the interpretations of universalism in our name is that we're bound together in this world, all of us. Your liberation and my liberation are tightly bound together. It's the same journey. Your salvation and my salvation. It means that I need you and you need me. That's an incredibly vulnerable thing that we don't often say as adults. Though we know it's true, our individualist culture doesn't often allow us to be real about how much we need one another, politically and spiritually. What I learned this week, reflecting on the 4th of July and our interdependence, is that the spirit of life stirs in our relationships. God's healing power emerges as we heal one another's wounds and hearts. We may not be able to immediately change the world like a great man, but together, we find the courage and the faith to keep a movement of love pushing forward one day at a time. Amen.